Just a quick introduction. My name is Michael Bennett. I work here at Rangle.io. I'm a front-end hacker. Well, more of a back-end hacker, but every once in a while they let me touch the front-end stuff. It's kind of nice. I want to thank Alan for talking about Webpack first. That was wonderful. I don't have to talk about any of those things now. And what I have for you today is a story from the trenches about upgrading Angular 1 to Angular 2 using Webpack and a moderately well-organized project. The project was nowhere near as large as Alan's. I mean, it was a toy project. Well, a little more than a toy, but not quite a real app. We'll be looking at roughly a few thousand lines converted, nothing like 75,000, but the principles still remain the same. And with migrations, it's a use case thing. So we're going to get started. Now, the first word is migration, not necessarily upgrade. I know there's an ng upgrade package. We'll talk about upgrading to Angular 1.x, and we'll talk about downgrading components, but really migration is the operative word, and they use that in the Angular documentation as well. And I think the reason they do that is because migration implies like a slowness or a certain sort of rollout, and you're not going to be updating your Angular 1.x apps to Angular 2 apps like the flick of a switch. It's going to take a little bit of effort. And the good news is it's not that hard, but there is a fair bit of work. So I would even go as far as to say that, like, fundamentally migrations are easy, but you'll notice by the troll face that that's not quite legitimate. So there's a couple different steps that are going to be common to every migration, but again, it's more or less a case-by-case basis. Every project's going to have their ins, their outs, third-party libraries that do crazy things that aren't going to work, and so you really have to take it one project at a time. But there are a lot of commonalities, and we're going to try and look at those today, as well as the time I had upgrading an application, which we'll get to in a bit. So the very first thing you want to do is modernize your tooling and get, ideally if you're working with Angular 2, Typescript will actually make your life a lot easier. I know Alan touched on Babel. Typescript will do a lot of the same things as Babel. It'll convert now ES6 code down to ES5 or ES2015 code down to ES5. It doesn't have a few features that Babel has. So if you're into really advanced Redux flows and you want those spread operators and whatnot, there's a few little tricks you have to do, but that's outside of the scope of this. So you definitely want those modern tools, though. They will really make your upgrading a lot easier. You're going to need to bootstrap Angular 2, the upgrade component of it, because what you're doing typically in these upgrades is you're actually running Angular 2 and Angular 1 at the same time. And we'll talk about some other options, like you don't have to do that, but that is the best option we've been exploring lately. And then the trick is to gradually upgrade your services and components, incrementally build up your application, make sure things work, follow the sort of best practices you should ideally be following anyway, test and repeat, and then eventually drop Angular 1. So, like I said, migrations do require a lot of effort. It doesn't really have to be hard, but you are going to be navigating your code base. You're going to be doing all sorts of little changes. Some of them you might want to do, some you might not. I had a lot of fun doing a lot of block scoping on the project that I'll get to in a bit. I don't know how many people really love const here, but it makes me really excited. I like read-only anyway. Okay, nobody. But the thing you really have to do is pick your upgrade strategy. And so there's essentially three major overarching strategies that you can choose from. There's your total conversion strategy, the NGForward strategy, and the NG upgrade strategy. And they all have their pros and cons, some more cons than others. So total conversion is the idea that you would take your project and go over it in one big refactor and convert it to Angular 2. And that's the sort of blink of a light switch idea. And if you have a very, very small project, that's going to work pretty well for you. But the downside is there's no incremental validation. So as you're working, you're not going to see any results because you'll still have bits of Angular 1 running and bits of Angular 2. And anyway, it'll just get depressing because you'll be sitting there not being able to see output, hoping that things work. And I mean, if you have really good unit tests, this might pay off well for you. But in most cases, the total conversion is just not going to be what you want. NGForward is another option that's out there. We haven't found a lot of great uses for NGForward yet, but there are definitely some. I think really old projects that predate Angular 1.3, where they have a lot of controllers and scopes and those sorts of things. Those projects might benefit because with NGForward, what you're doing is you're actually refactoring your project to be in an Angular 2-ish style. That means TypeScript and decorators and those things. But And you can build incrementally, too, which is great. So you can see feedback. And at first, it seems like a lot of fun working with NGForward. And I've done a few little applications with NGForward. But in the end, I found it was a lot more complicated because I ended up doing a lot of the same work twice. So I'm making stuff work or look like it works in the Angular 2 way, but the templates are different. So by the time you get actually to refactoring to Angular 2, you're still left with a whole chunk of your code base that has to be updated. And that's not the greatest always. But one good thing and bad thing about it is it is a third-party library, which means your support may vary. The guys behind it seem pretty solid, so you shouldn't have to worry about that. But the other thing is, though, as a third-party library and as the fact that it actually works exclusively with Angular 1, your older plugins and third-party libraries outside of NGForward that you're using, they have a really good shot of working still. So that can be a plus for some people. And what's also nice is it's all Angular 1, so you're getting one download. But again, you're more or less doubling your work, which is the main downside to NGForward. And NG upgrade is the hybrid approach, and it's what I'll be talking about for most of the time here. And I've got a little picture of Goldilocks and the three bears because it's sort of just right for most projects. And in the NG upgrade approach, you're going to be able to run, and you can run, Angular 2 and Angular 1 at the same time. This, of course, has the downside of the fact that you're loading both sets of code, but it has the upside that you can build incrementally and see that your project's working right away, which is always nice. It's really nice to get that validation right out of the box. It's provided by Google, so you get your first-party support. With any luck, it'll be around as long as both Angular 1 and 2 are around. Again, I've mentioned larger downloads, which is a bit of a downside, but I mean, it's all trade-offs, right? It's programming. And you have complications. So if you have components or directives that are using things like compile, they can cause you problems if you're trying to upgrade them. And so you have to be very strategic with your NG upgrades and do it really tactically. And then there's a couple things to keep in mind with this Angular app. When you're running Angular 1 and 2 through NG upgrade together, Angular 1 is always in control of the page. So it essentially is your application for all intents and purposes. And both of the Angulars, they each control their own segments of DOM. So if Angular 2 has a piece of DOM, Angular 1 can't touch it, and vice versa. Now, that's not going to be so relevant to our upgrade story here. We're going to be looking at a guinea pig application. So about 10 months ago, I was hacking around trying to make a silly little Markdown tutorial. It was more of a Markdown editor than a tutorial, but it was just something to do on the weekends for fun. And I actually think I only ended up doing 5 days of development. You can see it here. It's pretty hideous. We've got, now don't worry, nobody at Rangle was actually involved in the design. This is all me, so you can blame me for the horrific CSS, but it would let you write like 80 character wide Markdown on the one side and put things in and then render it. So you can see what's going on, and I mean, you can save these things as files like hello world and make new ones. So there's a little bit going on in the sense that there are some features that aren't quite in most toy apps, but it's also not super complicated. So it was a pretty good candidate, I think, to sort of walk through some upgrading bits for a presentation like this. So that's our guinea pig application. Not doing a whole lot, but doing just enough, hopefully, to get some points across. And it was written in Angular 1.3, like I said, about 10 or 11 months ago. And it has pretty decent code coverage. The build was passing, so I had Travis CI set up and all these other things. So that was pretty nice to actually get down and work with it. Unfortunately, though, that was back in the TypeScript 1.4 days. I don't know if anybody here writes TypeScript. Do we have any TypeScripters out here? We've got one guy, two. Okay, so not too many, but TypeScript 1.4 was sort of the dark ages of TypeScript. In TypeScript 1.5, the Angular team had a lot more influence. The TypeScript team had gotten a lot more mature, and we saw a much better product. As well, this MD tutorial, it uses grunt. Now, we just heard from Alan about webpack and other modern tools that might make your grunt life easier, and in fact, webpack did just that, and we'll take a bit of a look at that. And it has comprehensive test coverage, so it was pretty easy for me to validate that my stuff was working as I was going. So that was kind of nice in terms of upgrading. Now, it wasn't all roses, though, and we'll get there. So the plan I had in upgrading this application to Angular 2 was that I was going to modernize it to TypeScript 1.8, so that's 4 major releases up. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in TypeScript 1.8 that wasn't in the 1.4 era. We're going to upgrade from grunt to webpack, and Ellen did a great job of enumerating all the reasons why you might want to do that. We're going to bootstrap Angular 2, upgrade some simple services, upgrade the simple components, then upgrade the remainder, and then finally deprecate Angular 1, and then keep the testing up to date while we go. Or that was the plan. I mean, things went a little sideways, as they will, with an upgrade like this, but nevertheless, it worked. So modernizing TypeScript was the first step, and this was harder than I had actually imagined. It should really have been a simple process, you'd think. I didn't really need to change much in the way of code, but where things went sideways for me with the upgrading TypeScript was that 1.4 was a pretty old version of TypeScript. There wasn't first-class module support. So we just saw about these import-export ES 2015 modules and how great they are. Well, they didn't have those back in the TypeScript 1.4 days. You had native TypeScript modules or comment.js, and I didn't know about webpack back then, so I didn't know how to package all this stuff up and make it useful. So they have what are now called TypeScript namespaces. So essentially all the TypeScript was doing was producing one big JavaScript file. So I had to upgrade that. And the TypeScript flow was pretty complicated. I mean, back in those days when I wanted to get really fast results in a web application, I was essentially keeping my JavaScript as naked and as ES5 as possible and getting my browser to run it as is, and then just hitting F5 whenever possible. And now with Webpack, it'll refresh your browser automatically, keep all of your code up to date, and do all those builds behind the scenes that back in those days would have taken me a lot more time and been a lot more unfortunate. So modernizing TypeScript was a bit of a chore, and just getting through that and keeping the tests up to date was actually far more work than I had realized, but absolutely worth it in the end. We had to convert grunt to webpack. I don't know if it's obvious. This guy's grunting. It looks a little bit worse than that, but this is what I got when I was trying to find public domain images of people grunting. So actually, once I had the TypeScript in order, moving grunt to webpack wasn't actually as painful as I sort of had expected it to be. My biggest pain points with webpack were the fact that I am not a webpack expert as of this time, so I had to learn a whole bunch of stuff. So it would have been great if I had seen Alan's presentation a week ago, and then I would have saved myself some time. So I had to figure out, how to get SVGs in the best way, because I'd been using old loaders and so on and so forth. And just, you see these things written down, and you look for Stack Overflow posts, and different people have their different opinions. And eventually, between the blurry eyes late at night, you get it working. I had a lot of issues with Karma. Tests, we'll talk a little bit more in a bit, but getting Karma up to date was a bit of a hassle on this particular project. In other projects with Mocha, it's a lot easier, I found. But to a point Alan made in his presentation I was taking an approach where if it was working, I didn't really want to break it too much. And Karma lets you plug Webpack right into it. So that seemed like a pretty easy solution. I had some issues with Sass and Compass and getting those things working, issues that I've had with NPM through a number of different projects. I ended up solving those by finding some packages that just download all the Compass stuff and you can import it directly. And then in the end, I was left with even less code than I had in the beginning, and I got real-time debugging. So I was actually pretty happy with the results. And I think it was absolutely worth it, but it was a toy application made for this presentation. So of course it was worth it. That was the AC. So testing options. I looked at a couple different ones, like a plain Mocha, Karma with Mocha, and Carmen and Jasmine in Webpack. And because I had everything working with Carmen and Jasmine, I just stuck with it. I didn't want to have to rewrite the tests. I wanted them to keep working. And that approach mostly worked until I got to my CI. And then Travis is still having a fit with this. I still haven't resolved this problem. Tests pass locally, but for whatever reason, I haven't got them working remotely yet. So that was a little bit of a downer. Bootstrapping Angular 2, this was actually one of the least painful parts. At this point, once you got my flow up to date, it was much easier to start working with these tools, because when you go and you look out for any of the Angular 2 tutorials, I don't know how many of you guys have played with Angular 2. So we've got a couple people out there. Oh, a lot. Okay, that's great. So you'll notice in a lot of the Angular 2 tutorials, especially if you're following the TypeScript stuff, ES6 modules are everywhere. So once I had all that module system in place and my Webpack reloading and refreshing my browser automatically, bootstrapping wasn't so bad. There's a few little things you have to do, but it's not really that much. You've got to create an upgrade adapter singleton. So upgrade adapter is essentially an Angular 2 plugin that they give you with Angular 2. You don't have to download an extra package. You can just npm install Angular 2. It's all included. You just have to import it. And you've got to make a singleton, though. I ended up importing it into one specific file where I kept all of my little upgrade stuff, because there's a number of different things we'll see as we go through that you end up building with your upgrades. So you import the updater, and then you have to bootstrap Angular 1 manually. That's one of the key things. So normally in an Angular 1 application, you'll have NGApp probably at your HTML element or somewhere else, depending on what the purpose of your application is or its scope, and you'll let that do it. But in Angular 2, it's all done through JavaScript. So we actually have to do Angular 1, bootstrap it manually, and it's got control of the page. And then right below that, I do upgrade adaptor.bootstrap, and that's how you bootstrap Angular 2 in a hybrid app. And Angular 2 does not have control of the page, and it's actually that's not the real bootstrapper. That's just did I lose, or, sorry, we've got, there was a slight cable hiccup earlier. Anyway, that's bootstrapping. Sorry, wrong way. So a quick word, upgrading, downgrading, porting. This gets pretty confusing in the context of upgrading Angular 1 applications, because I've probably thrown the words around too liberally as it is. There's really specific nomenclature for this in the actual guidelines and documentations that you read. So when you actually upgrade, that's letting Angular 1 things work in Angular 2. And when you downgrade, that's letting Angular 2 things work in Angular 1. But you can't upgrade a component and use it in Angular 2 if you have no Angular 2 components to use that Angular 1 thing. So I've introduced the term port, and I'll use it for the rest of this. So I've been porting things to Angular 2 and then downgrading them to use them in Angular 1. And that's kind of the nomenclature we'll be using for the rest of this. And it gets a little weird because you'd think you're just upgrading stuff, but really you're porting and then downgrading most of it. So then the first thing I needed to do was sort of identify the services I wanted to port, because they're one of the easiest things. Like in Angular 2, there is a dependency injection system. It's actually more robust than in Angular 1 and more comprehensive, and that's a whole other talk unto itself. But the general rule is that the services that have the least dependencies are the easiest to upgrade, because chances are they might just be a class or a function. For the purposes of upgrading, it's easiest if they are, in fact, in constructor functions or classes, just because a lot of the Angular 2 stuff, especially the decorators, are designed around decorating classes. Although in Angular 2, it is worth noting you can do factories and all that wonderful stuff, but it's a little bit trickier to work them into an upgrade. So after you've got the easiest services, the next ones, you'll find you've upgraded some dependencies and then downgraded them to get them to work in Angular 2. The next set of services you have, you'll probably be able to find a crop that just have Angular 2 dependencies at this point. So then you can upgrade those, and then finally you're left with whatever is remaining. And hopefully that's just down to constants and whatnot. And if they're constants in values and a lot of things like that, I've started just moving those into ES 2016 modules. But the underlying application, this Markdown thing, it was actually making extensive use of the Angular 1 DI system, which I wanted to preserve for testing, but that was a whole other problem. So the first service I looked at upgrading, or not upgrading, see, I'm already messing up the nomenclature. The first service I looked at porting was the actual Markdown converter, because it just essentially wraps the marked library. And what it originally had was it was using $Q. So this was a $Q deferred that was going on before I converted it to a first-class promises, because we have those now. They're included in pretty much any Babel or TypeScript that you compile down will have promises built into it natively, which is actually quite nice. You can start getting rid of some of the promise libraries. So all I really had to do was take out Q and mark this as injectable with an @injectable. Which is not strictly necessary for Angular 2 DI, but that's, again, a whole other story, and import my marked. And so the marked import, my tooling all knew about this stuff because of typings. Typings for TypeScript are essentially header files, like if anybody's familiar with C and whatnot. They're basically lists that describe how your JavaScript is typed, and then you can use JavaScript with it. And so I have actual typings in this project for Angular and Marked and a few other things. You can get all of these through a loader called Typings, which is the newest one. There used to be a loader called TSD. It's since been deprecated. So I upgraded this service, and it was actually really easy. After I wrote that, all I had to do was tell Angular 2 about it. To tell Angular 2 about it, I just import my service class. I call my upgrade adaptor singleton, its add provider method, and then give it marked, and now Angular 2 knows about it. And then I had to tell Angular 1 about it. And to do that, I use this app.factory as just a shorthand for the return of angular.module. So that's imported from somewhere else, but it's more or less the same thing as adding a normal factory to Angular 1. It's just instead of calling the factory function directly, you pass it through the upgrade or the downgrade NG2 provider. And now Angular 1 can use my Angular 2 service. So that's actually pretty straightforward. And it feels really good once you get that part going. Actually, it feels good once you get the Bootstrap going, because the modernizing your application might be painful. I know it has been pretty much in every single one of these I've done. And then the transition actually does get a little bit easier. So then the next step is, of course, to deal with problems. So you're going to have to get used to seeing red if you're upgrading and migrating to Angular 2, because it's cropping up everywhere. Some of these problems will naturally go away as you just sort of find out, oh my gosh, I misspelled this thing. Spelling mistakes have been actually my #1 source of frustration from this stage on, which is kind of sad. Some of them are really easy to fix, like the spelling mistakes. Hopefully they don't lead you down a dead end, but really chances are you can just resolve the worst and things will work, and they'll go away as you migrate more of your application, which is kind of horrible advice to be giving, but it is a bit of a case-by-case thing with these upgrades. And then finally, commit. So once you've got a few things done, you're going to want to commit. So assuming everybody here uses version control, can we confirm that, please? We all love it. We can go back to stopping points in time and get ourselves out of a lot of trouble. And so typically with these upgrades, I'll get a few files modified and then start feeling really scary that, the next few things I do are going to break. And it's not those next few things that really mess me up typically. What happens is those few things lead to a problem, and then I try 5 other things to solve that problem, and the next thing I know, I don't know how to get back to the safe spot. So I love committing very, very frequently, and then trying to run my tests and make sure that they're up to date. Now, the testing story for this presentation is slightly incomplete, but when you actually start upgrading to Angular 2, you might need to start porting your tests and making them more unit-oriented, which is actually a really good thing. I've found a lot of the Angular 1 testing methodologies involved a lot of injection and whatnot, and we can get away from that and write more classically pure unit tests, which is actually kind of nice. And you can use whatever your favorite tools are to do that. So after I started looking at some of the simple services, we move into simple components. And so the most portable components are the ones that are analogous to very specific types of Angular 1.x directives. And so Angular, they call them component directives in the new nomenclature. And in Angular 2, they're full-on components. And these are very specific types of Angular 1 directives and the purposes of migrations. They have the following properties. They have to restrict to element. Much like Angular 2 components are always on an element. They have a selector. They have to have their own scope. They have to use controller as and bind to controller. They have to use template or template URL. And they can include require and transclude. And alternatively, as of Angular 1.5, you can use a .component to generate these. So you're not having to force this restriction. You can just go straight to the .component. Typically, though, I've been trying to think about it in my own head as these specific rules for directives, just because it's JavaScript. We have to learn, 10 new things every day. So the more I can relate it to what I already know really well, then the better for me. With these portable components, there's a few things you really have to avoid. You've got to avoid compile, you have to avoid replace, and you have to avoid priority. All of those 3 things will render your component inoperable in Angular 2 and cause a lot of confusing errors. So watch out for those when you're upgrading components. So again, the simple components, they're going to have the least dependencies, because then that's the least injection you have to worry about and the least sort of upgrading and downgrading of Angular 1.x and 2.x stuff you're going to have to do. Once you've gotten your first round, you might have another round that has only Angular 2 dependency, so those are almost free at that point to upgrade, which is really nice. And then try and pick the ones that are closest in the way they conform to the component directive spec. And I got kind of lucky, and we'll get into that with one or two of the components here. Don't worry about transclusion or projection. Both of those features, they're sort of the same thing. Projection, for anybody who doesn't know, is Angular 2's version of transclusion. Both of those actually work pretty much right out of the box with these things, as you would expect, which is really nice. I was really worried when I first tried to do transclusion and projection and crossing them over with different components that it wouldn't work, but it was very, very much plug and play. So the candidate component that I actually updated first was this sort of MDT prompt bool. So I'd been naming a lot of the stuff in this project with the MDT for Markdown tutorial and prefixing everything. And so that pattern will anyway repeat, but this guy, it had way too much logic in it, which is really the subject for a whole other talk, but so I've just dotted that out. And the reason I chose this was it only had one dependency. It restricted to E already. It had a link function, which is bad, but I could rewrite it to a controller pretty quickly. And it already had scope and a template. So it met most of the criteria, and given the limited scope of my toy project here, it was enough. And it ended up being converted into component code that looked more or less like this. So we had the same logic, but we've now got a proper class. We've got our selector, template. So that's a webpack require there. And I think it was over here too. That's also a webpack require. So what this actually does, to Alan's point, is it actually will load up whatever that file is and assign it to that variable. So it's actually really, really nice to work with. You don't have to think about where anything's going to go. You don't have to add a grunt task to do HTML packaging. They can all just build themselves right in. And we see it again in the component code there. This constructor here, if you're not familiar with Angular 2, it's not really obvious, but that's dependency injection in Angular 2 with TypeScript. That's, again, beyond the scope of today, but what this will do is TypeScript under the hood does know that capital MDT prompt service. It knows how to find that and inject that. And then we've got to tell Angular 1.x about it. So we need to register our app directive like we would normally, except that we call our upgrade adaptor singleton, we downgrade ng2 component, and we pass in the class for that component. And then it can continue to be used from Angular 1 at this point. Components are actually, in some ways, easier than services. So far we've been able to port and downgrade services, and we've been able to port and downgrade some components, or one component each, and just look at it. Some Angular 1.x bits in most projects, I didn't have to do it in this case, but in a lot of cases you're going to need to go the other way around. So you've got some stuff working in Angular 2, but it references your stuff in Angular 1, and you've got to go backwards. Well, this is actually upgrading Angular 2 stuff into Angular 1, and it's just as simple as the rest of it is. In this case, you tell Angular 1 about your directive, so it's sort of a normal Angular 1 directive here. I've just called it an Angular 1 component, and then you create an Angular 2 version by calling your upgrade adapter again, and this time it's upgrading ng1 component. And then somewhere in your Angular 2, and if you're not familiar with Angular 2 yet, don't worry, but typically your component, if it uses other directives and whatnot, will have a directives array, and you can include them in that, and that's the way things happen in Angular 2. And so that's all there really is to upgrading components. So then the last step is to port all of your remaining services and factories that you haven't done. So this is going to be iterative. You're going to be, changing them, breaking them, pushing through all of these painful edits that aren't really hard. It's mostly like, oh, that really got me. It's all of those silly little problems that aren't really complicated computer sciencey problems, but they give you endless frustration because some piece of punctuation is missing or what have you. And then finally, you get to a point where you can deprecate your Angular 1. And at this point, you can then prune your upgrade adapter, eliminate your Angular 1 registrations, use an Angular 2 root component. You can drop your Angular 2 upgrade Bootstrap, and then finally bootstrap Angular 2 its normal way. And in conclusion, it's a lot of work to migrate to Angular 2, and it can be very frustrating, but it is easy-ish for the most part. And every project tends to be different once you get into the nitty-gritty of like, what am I going to do first? What am I not going to do first? So you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. And at this point, yeah, I could do questions. I'd like to open it up for that. So